Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Jawad Dakhkan, Associate Director of Studio X Amman, a platform for experimental research in design, architecture, and the built environment that is run by the Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and the Columbia Global Centers in Amman. I would like to welcome you to the first webinar of the Emergency Urbanism, Infrastructure, and Cities series. In this series, speakers will reflect on urban adaptation and mitigation action plans that are in place to tackle the urban challenges that cities are currently facing. They will discuss how global agendas can be reconciled with the communities, cities, and nations' needs to pave pathways for sustainable development, as well as what they envision for the future of cities and urban life. We are grateful to our panelists and moderator for agreeing to participate in this discussion. And I would also like to thank my colleagues at the Columbia Global Centers in Amman, Rio, and Istanbul for their input. Before we start, I would like to briefly welcome our panelists and the moderator. Later on, I will introduce them more thoroughly. In this evening, we have the following panelists joining us. Start with Muna Fawaz, who is Associate Professor of Urban Planning Studies in the Department of Architecture and Design at the American University of Beirut. Pedro Rivera, who is the co-founder of RUA Architects and an adjunct assistant professor at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. Murad Gunai, who is a researcher and the coordinator for international cooperation at the Istanbul Planning Agency. And our moderator for this webinar, Masoud, who is the co-director of the Critical, Curatorial, and Conceptual Practices in Architecture program at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. It goes without saying that communities, cities, and nations have been confronted with a myriad of urban challenges, including inequality, urban density, lack of adequate physical and social infrastructure, access to affordable housing, as well as environmental health risks. The COVID-19 pandemic has further exposed and aggravated these challenges. Measures to contain the virus have disrupted public life, altered social coherence, and affected the built environment. The pandemic also reveals cities' interdependent infrastructure, the social and ecosystems, and interconnected vulnerabilities. In light of the current pandemic, the Emergency Urbanism, Infrastructure, and Cities series will examine issues related to how cities can respond, transform, and improve during such times of crisis. The series will bring together experts to discuss what is required to avert the indirect sociocultural impact that may result when urban life is interrupted, what city recovery strategies centered on inclusive and sustainable models are needed to address such challenges, and what are the lessons learned from previous work on urban resilience in terms of digitalization, mobility, density, urban design, collaborative governance, and action-oriented guidance to build back better cities. As for today's webinar, Emergency Urbanism and Preventive Infrastructures, we will explore how cities have responded to environmental disasters and disease outbreaks and investigate the interventions required to mitigate the effects of such emergencies. The panelists will provide insight into the preventive systems that are installed, required, and used in emergency anticipation and response. Without further ado, I'd like to fully introduce our panelists and moderator. We'll start with Muna Fawaz. Muna is a professor in urban studies and planning and the coordinator of the graduate programs in urban planning and design at the American University of Beirut. Her scholarly interests stem from the imperative of making cities more inclusive, particularly from the perspective of enabling low-income dwellers to take part in shaping their cities. Her work spans across the urban history and historiography, social and spatial justice, informality and the law, property and space, as well as planning practice, theory, and pedagogy. Pedro Rivera is also joining us from Rio. He's an architect and urbanist whose work flows between design and research, with concentration and relations among architecture, art, and urban inequality. He is a co-founder of RUA Architects in Rio de Janeiro and an adjunct assistant professor at GSAP, Columbia University. Rivera had works exhibited at MoMA in New York, Carnegie Museum of Art, the New Institute in Rotterdam, as well as the Architecture Biennales of Hong Kong, Chicago, Venice, and Sao Paulo. From 2011 to 2007, he was also director and curator at Columbia University's Studio X, Rio. He was in charge of curating and organizing lectures, exhibitions, and workshops, as well as researches such as Housing Project and Fight, Squat, Resist, which I had the pleasure of collaborating with him on this project. Moving on to Istanbul, Murad Gunai, who is a researcher and the coordinator of international cooperation in the Vision 2050 Office of the Istanbul Planning. His research interests include urban resilience, earthquakes, urban transformation, housing problem, and financialization, with a particular focus on the cities in the global south. Murad previously taught in the anthropology department at Boston University and worked as a postdoctoral researcher in the City Institute at New York University. He also received his PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. Last but not least, our moderator for this event, who is a great friend and a colleague, Masoud. Mark is a curator, writer, and an architect who teaches at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where he is the co-director of the Critical Curatorial and Conceptual Practices in Architecture program. Over the last decade, Mark developed a body of research and archival exhibitions that focus on under-examined practices of the post-war period. His exhibition were produced with various collaborators. Some of the exhibitions include Every Building in Baghdad, the Rifat Chaderji archives at the Arab Image Foundation and at the Graham Foundation in Chicago and at the LAX Art in Los Angeles. Also, Control Syntax Trio was exhibited at the New Institute in Notre Dame. And in addition to many other exhibitions, Masoud is the recipient of grants from the Asian Culture Council, the Graham Foundation, and the New York State Council of Arts. Now, before handing it over to you, Mark, I would like to remind you all to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We will try to get as many questions as we can. And thank you again to everyone in our virtual audience for being with us. And please join me in welcoming Mark Masoud. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Jawad, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to be here with you all. And thanks to those of you attending and to our speakers, Mona, Murad, and Pedro. Jawad asked me to join this event in part because of some of the work I've been doing over the last few years with a collaborator, my collaborator, Farzan Lutfi Jam. This work is one he mentioned. It's a series of projects called Controlled Syntax that look at the intersection of computation, algorithms, and city management. What we learned pretty quickly working on those projects, something that most people who look at this material understand relatively quickly as well, is that although smart city sensors and related operations are sold as systems that allow for smoother, more efficient, more environmentally friendly managerial control, they harbor an image or an imaginary of the city that is anything but well managed. Rather, they harbor an image of the city that is perpetually, potentially at the precipice of disaster. An easy way to illustrate this is by looking at the tracking algorithms that are constantly assessing the metabolic state of these cities that they're installed in and looking for anomalies. Any anomalies that appear often in these systems are categorized according to a hierarchy that begins with something minor, an incident, but that escalates to event, emergency, then crisis. As a result, these are systems that in their structure and in their code allow for the prediction of a city in constant crisis. And we can discuss today whether this is an apt or accurate depiction of our contemporary cities, and we can also discuss what comes with this characterization and construction. But one thing we know is that once we have implanted a conception of the city as a space of crisis, you can then more easily sell how it can be dramatically controlled. In some ways, these systems are a kind of anticipatory disaster capitalism. They profit from the specter of crisis and emergency before it has occurred. And such anticipatory disaster capitalism often goes hand in hand with disinvestment in conventional public welfare programs and hand in hand with the inverse investment in border security, immigration, and other global population circulation controls and restrictions, which is to say that this kind of imaginary of the city in crisis somehow mirrors the imaginary of global security crises that we're so familiar with, post 9/11 in particular. But the conversation today is not going to be about these automatic urban controls, but it's quite likely related to this last point. In the US, at least, COVID has served as a kind of center of failures in large part due to disinvestment in public welfare and public health. And as is so glaringly obvious, it also has revealed the failure of government decision-making and has illuminated so many other forms and sites of weakness and neglect, from housing to care. I mean, care in the specific sense of care homes and care facilities, but also care in the more expansive sense that so many people are concerned with now. And it's hard to speak about urban emergencies here today without COVID being here with us, invading our conversation as it does everywhere constantly now. But we're not only going to focus on COVID today, we'll also think about other fragilities and vulnerabilities in our cities, from those related to climate to other emergencies, those fabricated, those occluded or suppressed, or those we are managing to confront, and those that we still need to confront. So the format today is that we've asked our speakers to make a short statement about their work and possibly to show an image or two, to make a statement through those images in response to the topic. And then we're going to have a conversation among us. I'm going to ask some questions. The speakers are going to speak to each other, and then we're going to open it up for your questions, and we will continue there. So we're going to get started with Mona Fawaz.
Thank you so much first for this invitation, and good evening, everyone. I really want to thank Jawad for always reaching out and including me in fabulous conversations. It's an honor to be with you guys this evening. I look forward to the discussion. I am sorry not to disappoint you, but it's hard to speak of emergency and crisis about Lebanon without speaking about the recent port blast. So I'll start there and I'll link to the rest of the blast, the rest of the crisis, perhaps during the Q&A. And I'll start with the port blast that, as you all know, was triggered by 2,800 tons of ammonium nitrates that were callously stored in the city's port, a few hundred meters away from the city's residential district. Speaking of disinvestment, when you end up forgetting about something like this right in the middle of your city, there's very little you're thinking about in terms of people. They exploded in today unconfirmed circumstances on August 4, 2020. On that evening, people in the city felt the ground shaking twice, giving many the impression that an earthquake was unfolding. Seconds later, a massive explosion blasted. We're told it is the biggest non-nuclear explosion in history. I don't know if it's true, but it certainly felt from the shock and the fact that it was heard all the way to Cyprus, some 250 kilometers away. The blast caused devastating human and physical losses. When the counts were made the second morning, more than 200 people had lost their lives. Another 3,000 were injured with different levels of severity. Many were trapped under debris. Weeks after the blast, thousands of people have still not returned home. The blast severely affected the infrastructure, including electricity, which you see here, but also water. Tens of buildings were completely destroyed. Another few dozens at the risk of collapsing. At least 250,000 buildings were considerably damaged. 3 of the city's main hospitals had to be evacuated. About $5 billion in losses, including a lot of heritage buildings right around this district, which were inhabited until August 4 by many families, many under rent control in difficult conditions. The blast came at a moment when the country was already sinking into deep financial collapse. And when we look at these pictures, we have a sense that it can get worse, right? We need to speak of an emergency, and we have a sense that this is the emergency. And when we look however, when we look really at what causes this emergency or in what context it comes, it appears that many of the things that we're seeing, many of the devastation that is being lived actually precedes the blast. And if anything, the blast only accelerated what was already happening in the city. I don't have enough time to talk to you to describe everything, so I'll zoom in on just the districts of the blast and show you a couple of slides. What you see on this map are the buildings that were earmarked for demolition in the 15 years before the blast. Every orange point on this map is a building that was demolished in the last 15 years. Every building had at least several floors of families who lived there for many decades and were moved by investors, banks, real estate speculators who were interested in developing new constructions in the district. In addition, every turquoise building you see in the map was a building that was evicted and where no one had moved. We mapped them because we wanted to show the reaction in the city to the fact that the emergency caused by the blast was associated by many people to the fact that people were going to leave. We had to bring them back. We wanted to make the point that people were leaving, and they were leaving en masse way before the blast. Many people also complained that what was happening is a loss of urban heritage, and I made it a point to show you a few of the images. And yet, when we look at those orange points, many of them correspond actually to old buildings that had been earmarked for heritage, but that were removed through private negotiation, interventions by powerful actors in the city. Unless you think that this development is just about densifying Beirut and allowing for more, that it was only in the neighborhood where we're doing the analysis first, let me just very quickly zoom back and show you all of Beirut. The red point is the point of the blast. The circle is the point of the area that's heavily affected. The rest is the rest of Beirut, and every orange point is a demolished building, only in the last 15 years. Unless you think that this is done because of densification, because we're inviting people, allow me to show you one last map, which is the map of vacancies we mapped in Beirut. We do not call vacant buildings apartments that are owned by families who are expatriates and use them for 2 weeks in the year. We call vacant apartments that are either unsold, held by developers because they find it more lucrative to keep them than to sell them for the time being, or vacancy because someone bought them as an investment and has not even furnished them or spent a night in it. What you see here are rates of vacancies in the buildings developed in the last 20 years in Beirut. Mapped one by one, they correspond to 50% of Beirut's downtown, 30% of the districts around it that are posh, and go down at most to 20% in the lower income districts. And that, again, was not special to the neighborhoods around the blast. So if I show you all of Beirut, you would see the same pattern. Like to conclude by saying that these vacancies are not the result of only a dysfunctional market. They are actually encouraged by Lebanese public policy because we exempt vacancies from any taxes. So neither municipal nor property taxes are paid when your apartment is empty, which is one more invitation that combines to tons of public policies that incentivize investments in the built environment simply by keeping it empty. Why is this important? To me, this is important because if we're thinking of emergencies as simply the blast or the impoverishment that's brought about by the COVID crisis or the recent financial crisis that is happening in Beirut, we are not looking at the roots of what is happening in our cities. In Beirut, we have turned land into an investment and completely devoided it of its social value for 20, 30 years. We have created an urban fabric that is designed to make people more vulnerable. And the consequences of every crisis are lived inequitably and violently by people, the more vulnerable their tenure is in the city, and ultimately rendering Beirut a very vulnerable city, which could crumble the way it did on August 4, because we had prepared the ground for it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mona. We will move on to Murad.
Hi everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very timely talk. And thank you, Mona. It is a very interesting presentation. So unfortunately, I have a similar story from a different part of the world related to another sort of disaster, which is earthquakes. So just briefly, I can introduce myself. I am working in the newly founded Istanbul Planning Agency, supported by Istanbul Metropolitan Municipalities, NIV, local government. So we are trying to prevent and like improve Istanbul's resilience to earthquakes, because we lost so many time for preparations. So I will share my screen now. Okay, you can see it, right? So on October 30th, 2020, we had an earthquake near the city of Izmir. Izmir is the third largest city in Turkey, and the earthquake was about 100 kilometers away from the city center in the magnitude of 6.9. So what was surprising was that that earthquake was one of the deadliest earthquakes of the year 2020. So despite the fact that the epicenter of the earthquake is about 100 kilometers away from the city center, 17 buildings collapsed, 115 people died, and more than 1,000 people injured. So experts were very surprised to see that high number of casualties, because Turkey is preparing for earthquakes at least in the last 20 years. In 1999, we had a very powerful earthquake, not in Istanbul, but near Istanbul, east of Istanbul, in a magnitude of 7.4. This was 1999, and according to official numbers, about 20,000 people died. But according to unofficial, maybe 50,000 people died. So it was a turning point. After that, Turkey started to prepare for earthquakes, at least on paper, but we are, it seems that, not yet prepared. So Izmir earthquake should be taken as a warning for the upcoming Istanbul earthquake. So this is something very important map we prepared in Istanbul Planning Agency, and that is also, I think, a good example of disaster capitalism, because after 1999 earthquake near Istanbul, the government introduced a new law that makes expropriation of land easy for the government. So the government says that, okay, this is a disaster zone and you have to evict that area, right? So you have no right to object, because this is to protect people's lives, right? So then in the planning agency, we overlapped two maps. Like the first one is the orange areas, you see, areas that are designated under earthquake risk by the Japan International Cooperation Agency right after the 1999 earthquake. So these are the real, actual vulnerable parts of Istanbul, not only in terms of physical infrastructure, but also social infrastructure. And the red shaded areas are areas that were taken by the government, claiming that these are disaster risk areas. But these areas are actual, as you see, there is even no match. So these areas are not under earthquake risk. But what is particular about these areas are the land prices in these areas are high, right? So the government just exploited the earthquake to expropriate land on the one hand. And on the other hand, what happened? They didn't touch the vulnerable areas that needed a real risk-oriented urban transformation. So earthquake was used for a kind of capital-oriented urban planning. So what we started to do is, and like we lost about 20 years. So the expected, in the expected big earthquake in Istanbul, we expect about, like, this is the estimate, this is the optimistic estimate, like we expect about the collapse of at least 50,000 buildings. In Istanbul, there are more than 1 million buildings, and we expect that like at least 5% of them will completely collapse, which corresponds about like a population of 500,000 people. So this will be a disaster for Turkey and even a disaster for Europe, because Istanbul is the largest city of Europe. So, so we started to check now the buildings in these orange areas, the most vulnerable ones, one by one, and try to identify the buildings that will collapse first and try to prioritize our intervention, because we have limited resources and limited time, because we expect an earthquake in 30 or 40 years. This is what the experts estimate, and we are trying to gain some more time. But the struggle still continues. This is the third image I would like to show you. This is what the government still the central government tries to insist. So Istanbul is considered as kind of a source of wealth creation through construction. And now the central government constructed the largest airport of Europe in north of Istanbul. So this is a picture from an investment company. So Istanbul is advertised for its land. And so now the crazy project, like named by President Erdogan, so he named that project, canal project, parallel to Bosphorus, as a crazy project. In a positive, he means like, he implies a positive thing. So the government wants to create an island, want to convert the European side of Istanbul to an island, which makes Istanbul more vulnerable to earthquakes, right? So because it will be harder to evacuate the people, and in that island, there about like 8 million people are living right now. So now still we are struggling like to persist on risk-oriented and life-oriented urban planning, while like the central government and the capital owners insist on capital-oriented urban planning. So this is what I would like to show. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Murad. And we'll now jump to Pedro in Rio.
So thanks again for the invitation. I would like to talk a little bit about social organizations in Brazil and how they face COVID. Probably imagine that Brazil is like a tropical paradise, a place that the last war was in the 19th century, no volcanoes, no earthquakes. But Brazil was built up on violence. We have a very tragic history. We had the genocide of from 80 to 90% of the native populations in Brazil, and an economy that was supported by Black racism. For you to have an idea, Brazil is now the 7th most unequal country in the world, and 51,000 people were killed in 2018 alone by violence. No war, again, there's nothing, no thing like that. And 75% of the people who were killed in Brazil were Black people. If you look at the statistics by police, then it's records. So when COVID hit Brazil, it found Brazil in one of its most severe crises, being governed by an alt-right government, destructive government of Jair Bolsonaro, a kind of tropical Trump, who fired 2 ministers of health during the pandemic because they were doing their job. They were asking people to isolate, they were defending testing, they were defending science. So they were fired. We stayed 3 months without a minister of health. And we have now 170,000 people who died by COVID. Despite the fact that we have a very inclusive public health system, very very capillary in the country. It reaches most parts of the country. So what happened, and Mark was talking about, for example, the control syntax, the smart city center in Rio, we just neglected any kind of infrastructure and possibility to face the pandemic that we could have. So what happens when you reach a situation like that? Civil society has to respond. And I mentioned in the beginning that Brazil doesn't have hurricanes and wars and things like that, but we have, what I could say, let's say an everyday emergency. The emergence of poorness, the emergence of violence, the emergence of inequality. 20% of the territory of my city, Rio, for example, are informal areas, are favelas, where you don't have state presence, where you don't have public services, and so far and so forth. So in these places, a lot of organizations have arisen. And in general, these are bottom-up organizations, and they developed amazing technologies based on a very deep knowledge of the territories and of its people. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Very briefly. Okay, so how? Okay. So the question I was interested is how these social organizations, they have reconfigured their work. And I decided to interview the leader of one of these organizations, Eliane Silva. It's a little bit like I did in the work that Jawad have collaborated, that we interviewed leaders of social movements. So I wanted to understand how do they operate and how did they reconfigure themselves. So she's the leader of Redes da Maré in a complex of 16 favelas called Maré that hosts 140,000 people. So it's the largest favelas complex in Rio de Janeiro. To have an idea of the importance of this organization, I just want to mention one case. We have a city deputy who was Black, gay, and from Favela da Maré. And this woman only reached her mandate as a city deputy because of the programs of this organization. That one of the programs is dedicated to bring people to the university. Less than 1% of the people in Favela da Maré, they reach university. So this was one of these programs, among many other programs to empower people. Empower, not empower. So basically they work under 4 brackets. One is art, culture, memory, identities. The other is territorial development, which is particularly interesting for us, artists, geographers. Right to public security, and justice and education. Interestingly, when I asked Eliane, how were they prepared to face an emergency? And the first thing she said was, we live in an everyday emergency, as I mentioned to you, because police come here all the time. Like we had like 30 days, schools have no classes because of violence, and I don't know, 100 police operations per year, something brutal. But then as she started to talk about the organization, it starts to come out how they were able to reorganize what they do. And I'm not going to go deep in what they do or how they reorganize themselves, but I think that the most important thing is that they have a very holistic approach. So more or less they cover a wide wide aspects and a wide range of things within this community in an integrated way. And this allowed them to very quickly reconfigure themselves. So for example, this space is a space of a dance school that they have there. I mean, they have played many countries around the globe, etc. And it became a logistic infrastructure for distributing food. They found ways to get money, donations of food, and distribute food. So they were able to get money to spray the streets. I don't remember any other area in the city that people have sprayed the streets against COVID. They, for example, have a program to train a woman to cook professionally and also to generate income by training. So women are the most affected people by poorness. So, okay, there's no more buffet service. What we do? So there are the crack users, a lot of crack users in Maria. So they're going to cook for the crack users. So they quickly reconfigured. So now people will sew masks. So they quickly were able to adapt. And the most interesting thing that she, when I asked her, I mean, so we are still in the pandemic, but so far what they have learned is that by having to adapt and by having to adapt quickly, they got a much deeper knowledge of their own territory and the people who live in this territory. I also interviewed a person from another organization in Sao Paulo, and she told me the same thing. They found people that they couldn't reach before and that now they can reach. So basically what I think is that, I mean, when I look at these organizations and try to understand the technologies that they develop and the way that they work is basically, I mean, is how can we as trained architects, as trained geographers, trained policymakers, what can we learn from them? How can we incorporate their tactics, their strategies into our own planning? So this is my little introduction. Thanks a lot.
Hey, thanks, Pedro. Thanks, everyone. As I said, I've got a bunch of questions here, but if you guys feel like asking each other questions, obviously there are interesting intersections here, feel free. But maybe I'll start with something that you all touched on in a curious way, and maybe this speaks to the everyday emergency that Pedro is referring to. And by this I mean even though there are specific moments, events that are attached to what we're calling here emergency urbanism, like the blast in Beirut or the earthquake, you've all pointed to the way in which those events are not singular, meaning they are also part of other emergencies, or they are part of a structural system of which they are a feature, not an anomaly. And so I guess my question is how you think that relationship in the cities that you work on. And I'll just push this a little further. You know, when we talk about COVID as one of those singular events in this country, most people who think about it with any intelligence recognize that it's not a singular event, but it's something that's also overdetermined in the way that its path and how it moved through this country relied on the way in which our cities are organized, the way in which vulnerable populations are connected, the way the service economy is structured, et cetera, et cetera. So in thinking about your own work, how do you relate the singular emergency to something more broader? And I'm also wondering if that helps us think about what this term even means, emergency urbanism. Do we need a general theory of emergencies in relation to cities? because obviously there are climate-produced emergencies, there are war-produced emergencies, there are natural disasters, there are pandemics, and so how do you bring emergency thinking, both in its extended everyday sense, but also in its singular sense into the work that you do? Anyone?
Want me to start? I can try.
Yeah, please.
I can try and build on something I thought about a couple of years ago with my dear friend, Professor Hiba Bouakar, who teaches planning at Columbia. So with Hiba, we were thinking about how crises, what do you study at moments of crisis and why is it important, this crisis? And one of the things we were thinking about is the fact that during those moments of intensive upheaval, a lot of the power structures that are typically seamless, that organize and govern territories, suddenly become very visible. They come to the fore, and it becomes a moment in which you can really study them, see them, bring them to clarity. So if you think, for example, of the refugee crisis, which has really occupied Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, at least since for Lebanon, it's been since 1915, one flow after the other, and really the country's been a home for people who are displaced. But really, I think the Syrian refugee crisis was, in its scale and in its recency, has really demonstrated the extent to which the effort that gets placed by the international community, by the local states, by the different families at so many scales to recreate that imagined overlap between the biopolitical and the geopolitical governance of people comes back very powerfully. And you want to classify people who even the creation of modern nation state did not manage to classify. So the boundaries between Lebanon and Syria to the north are completely fluid. People work in one place, get medical treatment from the other. Since the invention of Lebanon as a modern nation state happened in 1920, it sort of became harder at some points, but it still was really fluid. Families extend over the two borders. But then the refugee crisis suddenly makes it really necessary to create those ruptures. And with them, the work that goes into making those divisions becomes very clear. So fast forward now to some of the work we're doing in relation to the COVID here at the Beirut Urban Lab with colleagues like Gunai and Ahmed Gharbiye. We are looking at how the COVID crisis also affects boundaries and territories in the country. And here what's interesting is it's not the bottom-up sort of solidarity movements only, although they appear in continuation with the kind of crisis you see in Lebanon. But what is very interesting is the effort that political sectarian parties in Lebanon exert to recreate the geography of sectarianism that makes up Lebanon and that allow each party to control its territory. So strategies and images like those we saw with Pedro, cleaning streets, creating confinement centers, doing soup kitchens, all of these become ways in which each political party can regovern its territory. And suddenly what you took for granted, that this place is this place is that, you can really visualize and understand the kind of labors that goes into creating these urban divisions. So I found emergencies, and I'm just giving two examples. We could really talk actually about the Beirut disaster also as another instance of the same, because the political parties that emerge to sort of create their territory and decide that they have to rebuild it, and the reaction from the bottom up of communities that say, no one will rebuild it, we don't want the state is a culprit, we will do it. And this kind of sort of populist, we will rebuild discourse that sometimes happens sadly at the expense of those who need their homes, but that's another conversation we can touch on. What does it mean to try to do all of this without a state, when the state remains in the imaginary custodian of the public good? But despite that, just for now, just to think for a minute, we again see efforts to even govern the post-disaster recovery in very fractured way, where certain territories that are considered, for example, a Christian territory, you want to block land sales so that you contain the territory. So it goes back to the control of the specific political parties that hold it. So I found Emergencies very, very productive from that sense in trying to understand how it's these divisions, these hates, these us versus them get really cemented in those moments.
Yeah, I can continue maybe.
Right.
So continue from the Syrian refugee crisis, which is also related to Turkey. So yeah, I agree that emergencies can be productive, but they can be also like disastrous. So in both ways it works. So it opens up, I think, possibilities. So for instance, like Syrian refugees, when they came to Turkey, they were used as like free labor. Like in Istanbul, there are about 500,000 registered Syrian refugees. They are even not considered, by the way, refugees. They are considered people under protection or something. So, and we have another 500,000 Syrian refugees. They are completely undocumented. So they have nowhere to go, no court to apply. So, and used kind of slave labor, and they are just used as consumers to like accelerate the economic growth in Turkey. So in terms of the earthquake, also it opens up possibilities in both positive and negative ways. As I said, like the government exploited the earthquake disaster to expropriate land. But the Izmir earthquake also made us think about new possibilities. So very recently, now we are working on the empty buildings in Istanbul. So because of this construction boom, right now in Istanbul, there are more than 250,000 apartments. So these are like not half made. They are fully completed apartments. So you can go in and just settle. And as I said, like we expect the collapse of 50,000 buildings. So politically, just with one decision, we can move in all these people who are living in vulnerable buildings to these empty apartments, right? So just in one day, politically, we can solve the problem. So which makes visible the fact that like natural disasters are actually not natural, right? Like they are political, social, and structured. So we can use them to create more opportunities, like to think about empty buildings in a different way, right? We can think about empty buildings, completed but not sold yet buildings, as residents' right to live, to settle, use in that way, or we can leave them empty for making more capital and leave like 500,000 people under danger. So that emergency, like this Izmir earthquake, at least reminded us that this is a choice, right? This is a political choice. So I think at the end, this is something positive, right? So it makes us think.
Mona did a very important comment, which is how the territories of the city are disputed. And in Rio, I mean, it's a very complicated situation, as we have many militias and drug dealers disputing the territory. And they have like centers of service, like they give little things, they do little medical things, but all controlled by these groups. But it's also a fact that these groups, they weren't able to organize themselves in the crisis here. They didn't show any kind of response. Also because the president himself is somehow connected to this group. So it's a kind of I don't know, kind of an ideological issue, I guess. But they weren't able. And many of the social organizations, they do a lot of advocacy with government. They really pressure government for doing the job. The fact that they do the job doesn't mean that they don't go after government to ask them to do the job. And I think that the success of Redes da Maré is based on three pillars. which are pillars that we can scale to whatever scale that we want, and which is a kind of to have a flexible infrastructure, so things that can be adapted quickly, have a lot of data and information about the territory and about the people, so you can quickly map what is going on and identify vulnerabilities, opportunities, and communication, and how fast and how clear you can communicate to people. And I really think that this is valid for the scale of a neighborhood, but it's also valid for the scale of a country. And perhaps all these things, they wouldn't work if they are not under one umbrella, which is you must build a social pact. When you face an emergency, you need to establish a social pact, which most of the people, most of the countries, they have done. So we have to understand that we have something similar to we have the same battleground, and we have to deliver our efforts in the same direction.
Yeah, that's all of super fascinating responses. Also, the question of the battleground, I think, is super important around the emergency urbanism. But I guess my next question is going to follow up on this a little bit, but also to come back to Mona's extraordinary articulation of the what to call it, like the disaster illumination effect that happens with an emergency, meaning that surprisingly, the emergencies in Beirut and Lebanon reveal existing power structures in a sense, and they become exercises in re-implementing that power in a way that makes it visible, and it might not have been visible. And so this is the paradoxical condition in which the emergency, which is supposedly a rupture of some sort, in fact is a stabilizer of politics, of territory, of social relations. But I'm also wondering is there something inversely true, which is to say that the emergency, in fact, is a destabilizer in the way that we might expect. And here I'm thinking of what Murad was saying about how the emergency of the earthquake is used opportunistically to make claims about earthquake sites and risk zones. And so the emergency is a way in which, let's say, new financial and conditions and structures, new governmental powers, new market powers exert themselves. And so I don't know if maybe you've already answered this in each of your presentations, but maybe you can talk about the other side. Like what are the conditions of stabilization and destabilization that we can read around the emergencies you work on?
You guys want to really observe the order? Okay. I completely agree that it's two things at the same time, and I completely agree that that it's an opportunity. I mean, the COVID was a great moment in Lebanon. If you start with October 2019, the economic system that has been in place since the end of the Lebanese civil war is getting to its logical conclusion. There's a big financial meltdown. There's massive protests, the biggest protests since for decades. And we built tents in Beirut downtown. We decided we're taking over the historic core. We did soup kitchens. We did daily discussions and debates and awareness raising. We demanded accountability. We put psychological clinics. Like, we built the imagined state or social pact we dreamt to have right there on the streets. And it was happening a little bit in Chile at the same time. So we're being inspired. We were learning, we were repeating the dances. Like, there was a moment in which you felt that, and then the COVID crisis comes and they tell us lockdown, right? And so right as people are beginning to wonder, how are we going to keep sustaining this? We need to go back to work. We're getting impoverished. The Lebanese pound has lost 80% of its value. We need to go back to our jobs. The pandemic comes, and it's a great thing for the Lebanese government because it basically creates that lockdown. So certainly that's one of many examples that we see. The management of the refugee crisis is an incessant emergency situation. The post-disaster recovery of the Beirut blast is again that same kind of euphoria where people say we don't care about COVID anymore, and so they establish tents, they try to do the same, and again they send in the army and they hand over to the army the management of the neighborhood because this is an emergency crisis. So I think, yes, there's something to be said about the mobilization that happens. And I think that one after the other, when crisis becomes so recurrent, that mobilization becomes really the source of hope, because you start seeing the lessons being shared, the networks being built, the infrastructure of transformation being set in place. My only worry is in romanticizing this and in emphasizing this too much in a context where a lot of my colleagues and friends who are urban planners are saying, just forget about the state right now. Don't talk about it. Focus on these people. Try to help them. And I say, well, wait a minute. I mean, these guys are still making the rules. They're still sending the developers. They are still exempting vacancy from taxes. They're still buying up stuff. So we can't forget about them, because it's not a level ground where I can just build things. And I think this is where it becomes really hard to imagine even your role. I mean, if we're talking as planners, as architects, that you imagine really your role. Is it that easy? You can position yourself just with the protesters and you're building that alternative, or do you have to also weigh in somewhere else? And I think this is something I'm really struggling with right now. So maybe others want to weigh in.
Yeah, all these emergencies are kind of sort of like destabilizing, right? So, and all these moments of destabilizations are new opportunities. So this COVID pandemic is the same, and it reminded us that how we are so much dependent on each other, right? So, and for instance, it reminded us like how important is how we design our cities, right? So certain parts of the city are completely dependent on public transportation. Some parts of the city are have less access to healthcare facilities. So, and you have to take public transportation to go to hospital, which makes you like for that you get risk of getting COVID. And the Minister of Health in Turkey appears on TV saying that I suggest you to stay home, but you also have to go work, right? So that COVID pandemic made all this contradiction maybe visible, very visible. These are there, but we might not think much about those. We don't contemplate on those things, on those contradictions. But now it's so obvious, like it made all these contradictions, these emergencies, made all these political contradictions very visible. Again, I consider that, of course, this is a very sad situation, but also these are some political opportunities to think differently. Yeah, thanks.
It's strange to, I mean, we are in the middle of the hurricane, so it's hard to understand what is really going on and what will happen after, once this is gone. But I think that, I mean, we have two emergencies here. We have the emergency in Brazil. We have the emergency COVID, and we have the emergency of Jair Bolsonaro. I mean, it's an emergency. It's basically it's turning down everything that we have and everything as we know. It's a revolution in a very bad sense. But at the same time, I want to take one example, which is our public health system. And everybody here is also related to Colombia, and we're talking to the global centers. And we imagine that the US doesn't have a public health infrastructure, and we do with our problems. And it's being beaten constantly. No, we have to privatize parts of it, and we have to change that, and it's very inefficient, and it's very bad. And I mean, everybody's beating on that. And there was a shift in the perception of our health system by our people, by the people in Brazil, despite it being run by such government. But the way that people value the public health system now changed, and people are again proud of having a public health system. So what I want to say about that is that all this solidarity that happens in an organization, and these things that somehow we put together, and we also realize how fragile we are, because we are fragile, and this exposes our fragility. I think it also helps us to understand, I mean, wait, we need to have something common. We need to be together. We need to put some things together to be able to face some things. So I mean, I don't know if I'm being naive or not, but I believe that somehow this is a lesson that we need government. We need our government to do things for us, to we need retirement when we get old. This is what happened in Chile. We need a public health system when we have a pandemic, or which what we have, we are realizing now. I mean, so, and somehow I think this allowed us to dream again with things which are so important to us, that have been globally for the past 20 years being, no, it's efficiency, competition. We have, I mean, so somehow I like to believe that we value those things again, and I hope that we are able to value those things again.
There are a bunch of questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to turn to a couple of those for a second. But one of them, I guess, picks up on this, our collective fragility that has been ever more exposed recently, but also in the desire for how we respond to that feeling of fragility, and whether that's new forms of political action or new expectations. And so the question is worded as this: do emergencies change what citizens expect from the state? Are we seeing the waning of the authority of the state and the search for other ways to organize the provision of services? And so that's the question as it came in. So if any of you want to respond to that, I know you've already spoken about that in a certain way, but I feel like that question confronts that issue of whether the response has to come through new modes of imagined social organization and collectivity, or new demands placed on the state and government response. Anyone feel like pursuing this? Mona?
I can just say a couple of words. I think that it was very interesting to see how much, and not only really in Lebanon, but also reading and listening to colleagues in many of those in several of those conversations of urbanism in the global south, that there was a sense at the beginning of the pandemic that we wanted a public sector. We wanted to recover that notion that there could be a custodian of the common good. And we are at a loss in finding another party that can do it. We intellectually, as academics, understand that the moment of the nation state and its role as a custodian of the common good is maybe an error of an imagination of modernity, let's say that. And that it's a moment in history that's contained, and that we're probably moving somewhere else. But I really echo Pedro's sentiment that we feel that the model as it has become is even worse right now. And so while maybe 30, 40 years ago, we looked at modernity and disagreed on those notions of sameness and that were imposed, we're now looking back and saying, at least at that point, there was a commitment to equal rights, to equal entitlement that we have lost in the current economic models. So from my experience, there's been a lot of that. And even the protesters who I know went in Beirut, because we are ruled by the most corrupt government there can be, went there because they wanted to build a different custodian of the common good, a different state, and not to sort of reject the model. Even if we look with a lot of skepticism at the forms of nationalism that the idea of the state may carry, which many people distance themselves from. So maybe one new way to think about things is this whole idea of city/citizenship, where our belonging to the city, of the shared spaces in which we live, can allow us to begin to think about other forms of collectivities outside of belonging to the state.
Thanks, Mona.
Can I give a little comment here? Let's take as an example George Floyd's murder in the US, okay? Which happened during the pandemic. And has like a gigantic outreach all over the world. And we just elected mayors. We had the second term on Sunday, so we have new mayors sitting in place. So both Rio and São Paulo elected, let's say, center, how to say that, center? Politics in the center. They are not very right, not very left, they are more or less in the center. But both already said that they commit to have women and Black people in their cabinets. And I think that the fact that this discussion about minorities have reached so much importance in a country that, I mean, we abolished slavery 100 years ago, and we always denied that exists racism in Brazil. I learned in school that there is no racism in Brazil, that we are a culture of mix. And now people are clearly speaking about structural racism. And I wonder if the pandemic, if our fragility played a role on that, showed us, and at the same time, no more, you know. So I think there are things that really change, you know.
Yeah, I agree. I think like all these emergencies may seem the government very like it discloses the fact that the government is actually very incompetent in terms of dealing with real emergencies. Governments in the world, it seems, that can not deal with the climate crisis. They cannot deal with earthquakes. Also, the pandemic, like, it's kind of a like political disaster as well, like how governments in the world deals with the COVID. So it reminds us, it reminded people that we are the government, right? So we have to deal with all those problems, and we have to solve all those problems. So we need different alliances in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our locals, so to overcome all these problems. Because when there is an after the 1999 earthquake near Istanbul, for instance, like, there was no government for maybe a week, so people saved each other, right? So, and also in terms of the pandemic, now we know that no one will protect us, so we have to save each other somehow. So maybe somehow, yes, all these emergencies both made us feel less powerful, but somehow also makes us think how we can get more powerful by experimenting on new kinds of alliances in our local areas, like neighborhoods. Yeah.
Yeah, super great answers. I'm not sure how we're doing for time. Maybe we'll do one more question, Jawad. And this follows up a little bit on what you guys are just saying. So it's a kind of natural follow through, and kind of in the spirit of we're not going to take it anymore. Pedro's exhortation to not return to where we were before. This feeling of fragility has that since we've embraced this feeling of fragility. The question is this: how can more ecological and environmentally sustainable urban mobility be planned into post-pandemic cities? And just to say that it feels like this is a question that asks, in a way, how, if this current COVID emergency is an impetus to think collectivity differently, to think our relationship to states differently, to think political action differently, how can the pandemic be mobilized to help us think long-term structural urban ecological problems differently? And if any of you have an answer to that, I'm sure the world would be interested in hearing, but maybe you also have thoughts on how to how to continue to think differently urban space. Yeah.
Make a lot of lives. Well, I don't think there's an easy answer. An easy answer to that. I mean, I think that one of the challenges that we have now is to understand how people will react to living in density once the pandemic's over. I think this is a very important question. I bought a car. I didn't have a car before. I bought a car, so I lost I lost credits. So we have to understand. I mean, how is it? How our behave will be from now on? Will we continue to celebrate density? Are we going to move back to suburbs? I really don't know what is going to happen about that.
I'm a CTP person, and I think they won't die. Look, the pandemic has brought a lot of concessions around the world, and if you look at the reports that were put out by UN Habitat, by the UN rapporteur on the decisions of cities to freeze mortgages payment, to freeze rents, to freeze evictions. We have seen that city authorities, housing agencies can actually create things that we've been demanding for many years for more inclusive cities. And so there is no reason. We have seen in cities, informal settlements, camps that had been demanding water for decades, getting it finally, right? Because suddenly we need them to wash their hands so we don't get sick. So if we look at the pandemic as a beginning, and we say that those concessions are things we want to keep, and they should be a place from where we can begin, I think we have already the beginning of a political project. And what I want to say is, our cities are ravaged by financialization. Many, many cities are ravaged by financialization. And while financialization, and I mean by this, the way in which capital penetrates the built environment and allows for speculative interest to trump the social value of a place as a home, as a place to work, as a place to live, because our cities are ravaged by financialization in different forms, and yet it happens in all the places. It's a convergence that happens because of the consultants, of the flows of capitals, of the network of banks. But we are now, and we have really benefited at some level, at least some of us had the privilege to benefit during these last months from conversations across contexts that we couldn't do before. So is there a way to begin to think networks of resisting eviction, networks of thinking about how to make the concessions that every city made become more permanent? I think there is room for hope there. And that these are places where, again, I mean, I want to go back to my provocation that you are professionals. You're not an informal settlement dweller working with your neighbors to get water to your neighborhood. You have privilege and access. So can you use it to do something good? And I feel we do have some grounds here to build on. So perhaps from that place, we can begin to think the models of ecology and the models of more inclusive cities that we dream to see happen.
Yeah, I just want to add that, like, in terms of the urban mobility, this pandemic reminded us how, like, accessibility to public resources is so important. Like this idea, like 15-minute city, which I think is a topic of a next webinar. So, like, hospitals, schools, groceries, they should be accessible from any location in just 15 minutes by walk or by bicycle. So this is kind of an ecological solution, as well as lesson that was taught us by this pandemic, how this is so important, because, like, certain neighborhoods of the city are completely inaccessible to all those resources, right? So people should take 3 different buses to go to a hospital, and just for shopping they need to take like 3 different trains, and so 15-minute city.
About it?
Sure.
I worry about segregation and social division in this 15-minute city. I worry about enclaving. I worry about all the encounters you do in the city just because you have to go to other areas for many things. So how does this live with our ideals of inclusivity and social justice? I don't know. It bothers me.
Yeah, but I think, like, you can have some vital access to vital resources in your 15-minute area, but you still should be able to have access to also kind of public transportation to go other parts of the city as well. And some locations, some neighborhoods have also even no access to public transportation. So this is another issue that results in segregation, right? So we can have both, I think, 15-minute city plus a good transportation network.
This is a question of inequality. Mona's question is a question delivered for countries where you have huge inequality and where cities are split. The areas, different areas of the cities are really split. If we think of, let's say, a country with low rates of inequality, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but I understand your concern here. But we cannot forget that the state of art today is spending 2 hours on a bus going and 2 hours on a bus going back. So nobody can access anything when they have a workload, which is equivalent to the workload that they already have. This question of how populations circulate in the territories and how infrastructures are distributed in the territory, I think they are really essential and crucial to think that we can live better.
Well, I think to wrap it up, thank you everyone. I mean, I'd love to kind of continue the conversation a lot, but unfortunately, due to the curfew that kind of is imposed in Jordan, I mean, I do love my office, but I think if we keep on talking, I'm pretty sure the conversation would kind of take on for another half an hour actually. And I prefer to sleep at home. Maybe I do love my office, but I mean, today's conversation was quite interesting. It was quite interesting to see kind of how different cities are kind of responding, kind of experiencing such emergencies. On one hand, we are talking about COVID, but also, I mean, talking about emergencies in general. And thank you so much for your time. I know that recently now all the Zoom calls and all those meetings are quite being hectic and we're being dragged into kind of many more conversations. But thank you for allocating the time. Thank you, Mark, for moderating. Thank you, Murad, Pedro, and Muna for us. It has been amazing kind of a conversation to have with you. And maybe before, I'm not sure if anyone has any kind of final comments. If Mark, you have any final comments, I would like to remind everyone who is kind of tuning in that this is part of an ongoing series called Emergency Urbanism series. And we do have another event coming up on the 16th. So we'd be happy if you would join us on the 16th. And again, thank you to everyone who joined, and thank you, Mark, Murad, Pedro, and Mona. Thank you, everyone.